The small house was quiet, except for the sound of their mother moving around in the kitchen. 5 teenagers sat together in the living room, their faces heavy with worry. The walls of the house held memories of laughter, birthday candles, and the smell of warm food. But lately those same walls felt smaller, tighter, as if they were closing in on the family. Their mother tried to hide her struggles, but the children could see the weight she carried every day. Bills piled up on the old wooden table, envelopes marked with red letters that shouted of deadlines and payments. She worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, and came home late at night with tired eyes and aching hands. Yet it was still not enough to cover everything. Teenagers loved her deeply and hated watching her silently break down when she thought they were asleep. They knew she didn't want them to worry, but how could they not? The threat of losing their home was no longer just a fear. It was a reality pressing against them with every passing day. They overheard conversations between their mother and the landlord. Words like last chance, final notice, and eviction. Those words burned in their hearts. This was the only home they had ever known. A place where they shared secrets, where they comforted one another, where they dreamed of better days. Losing it felt like losing a part of themselves. The oldest among them spoke up one evening. His voice was calm but filled with determination. He reminded his siblings that they had one thing that had always kept them together, even in the hardest times: their love for music. Since they were little, they sang together, creating harmonies that filled the air with warmth. They had an old guitar passed down from their father, a small keyboard that had seen better days, and a couple of makeshift drums made from buckets. Their voices blended naturally, and though none of them had formal training, the way they sang together carried a raw emotion that could move anyone who listened. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was theirs. An idea was born in that quiet room. If their mother could work tirelessly for them, then maybe they could do something too. Maybe, just maybe, their music could help raise the money they needed. They didn't dream of making a fortune. They only hoped to save enough to keep their home, to give their mother one less burden to carry. It was a wild idea, uncertain and risky, but it was better than sitting still, waiting for everything to fall apart. The teenagers decided that they would take their instruments and perform on the street. They had seen others do it before, and while it wasn't easy, they believed that their sincerity and unity might touch people's hearts. That night, as their mother slept exhausted on the couch, they quietly practiced their songs in whispers. Their voices were soft but full of hope. Each note carried the promise that they would not let their family break apart without a fight. They knew there would be challenges. People might laugh at them, ignore them, or even tell them to go away, but they were ready to try. They had no other choice. The next morning, they woke up early and packed their little collection of instruments. The guitar was carefully wrapped in an old cloth to protect it. The keyboard had missing keys but still played enough for them to carry a tune. The buckets they used as drums were stacked together, and one of them carried a small cup where they hoped people might drop coins. Their clothes were simple, worn out in some places, but they didn't care about appearances. What mattered was the strength of their voices and the truth behind their music. As they stepped outside, the sun was rising, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The air was cool, and the streets were slowly coming alive with people rushing to work, vendors setting up stalls, and buses filling with passengers. The teenagers looked at one another, nervous but united. They knew once they started, there was no turning back. This wasn't just about singing. It was about fighting for their family's survival. They walked together to the city square, their steps heavy, but their hearts beating fast with anticipation. The place was noisy, filled with cars honking and people talking, but they found a corner where the flow of pedestrians was steady. They set down their instruments and took a deep breath. The oldest strummed the first chord on the guitar, and the sound cut through the morning air. One by one, the others joined in, their voices blending into a harmony that carried farther than they imagined. Their music wasn't perfect, but it was pure. Every word they sang carried the truth of their struggle, the love they had for each other, and the hope that someone might listen. At first, only a few people glanced their way. Some passed by without stopping, while others gave them curious looks. But the teenagers didn't let that discourage them. They sang louder, stronger, pouring their hearts into every note. Their voices echoed with courage, their music rising above the noise of the street. Slowly, a couple of people paused, listening for a moment before moving on. Then one kind stranger dropped a coin into their cup, and the soft clink of metal gave them a spark of encouragement. Another person smiled and left a small note. Little by little, they were being heard. By the time the sun climbed higher, the teenagers were sweating from the effort, but they didn't stop. Each song they sang felt like a promise to their mother, a message that they would not let her fight alone. Though their earnings that morning were small, their determination grew stronger. This was only the beginning. They believed that if they kept going, something good would happen. They had no idea that destiny was already watching them from a distance, preparing to test their faith in the most unexpected way. The teenagers stood in the busy square with their instruments, their voices still trembling from the effort of their first songs. Their small cup had only a handful of coins, but even that felt like hope in their hearts. They looked at one another, exchanging quiet smiles, as if to say, "We can do this." The oldest strummed the guitar again, this time with more confidence, and his siblings joined in with renewed energy. The crowd around them was small but growing. People were starting to take notice, not just of the music, but of the determination written across the faces of those 5 young performers. The sound of their voices began to blend with the rhythm of the street. Buses rumbled by, vendors called out their prices, and footsteps echoed across the pavement. Yet, every time the teenagers lifted their voices in harmony, the noise seemed to soften for a moment. Some people slowed their pace just to listen. A few clapped along, others nodded their heads to the beat. The teens were nervous, but they sang with such emotion that it was impossible to ignore. Their music was not polished or perfect, but it carried a sincerity that touched people in ways they did not expect. Soon, someone pulled out a phone and started recording. Another stranger whispered to their friend, pointing at the siblings. Little by little, more people gathered near the corner where the teenagers stood. Some leaned against lampposts, others stood with bags in hand, their faces curious. A woman with her daughter stopped, and the little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, insisting they stay to hear the song. The teenagers, unaware that they were becoming the subject of whispers and recordings, focused only on each other and the music that bound them together. The donations were still small coins, a few crumpled bills, but each one felt like a victory. They weren't thinking about the exact amount. What mattered was that people were noticing, people were listening. For the first time in weeks, they felt a spark of hope stronger than fear. Their mother's tired eyes came to their minds, and the thought of her holding on, trying to keep the family together, pushed them to sing louder. Every note became a promise. They would not give up. They would not let her carry the weight alone. Hours passed. Their voices grew hoarse, and their hands ached from playing, but the siblings kept going. They rotated songs, sometimes cheerful, sometimes soft and filled with longing. Each song carried a piece of their story, even if no one knew the details. When they sang about dreams, it wasn't just a song, it was their dream of keeping their home alive. When they sang about family, it was their love for their mother echoing in the air. People could feel it, even without knowing their full struggle. That honesty in their music was what pulled strangers closer. By midday, their corner was buzzing with life. The sound of applause began to follow each song, a small but powerful reward for their courage. Someone shouted, "Sing another one," and they obliged with shy smiles. They weren't used to being the center of attention, but now their voices carried with strength. A man dropped a larger bill into their cup and gave them a nod of encouragement. Another offered them bottles of water, saying they needed to take care of themselves if they wanted to keep singing. These small gestures felt like kindness they hadn't expected. For once, the world didn't seem as harsh as it had the night before. As the sun burned hotter overhead, one of the siblings noticed a group of teenagers nearby whispering and giggling. At first, they worried it was mockery, but then those teens pulled out their phones and started recording with big smiles, swaying to the music. They even shouted words of support, drawing even more people to the crowd. The 5 siblings realized something important. Their music was no longer just a way to earn money, it was creating a connection. People were not only giving them coins, they were giving them hope, smiles, and encouragement. It felt like the city itself was slowly beginning to root for them. By the afternoon, exhaustion began to set in. The guitar strings felt rough on the fingers, and the makeshift drums had dents from constant beating. Their voices cracked here and there, but they never stopped. Instead, they laughed through their mistakes and kept singing. Their togetherness was their strength. Passers-by could see it, the way they supported each other, the way they smiled through the struggle. That unspoken bond between siblings was what gave their performance a magic that no professional show could replicate. As the day wound down, their cup had filled more than they imagined. It wasn't enough to save the home yet, but it was something real, something tangible. They gathered the coins and notes, counting them carefully with trembling hands. It wasn't much in the larger picture, but to them, it felt like proof that they could fight back against the impossible. They laughed softly, relieved, their eyes shining with a mix of exhaustion and pride. When they finally packed up to head home, some of the crowd clapped for them one last time. A woman shouted, "Come back tomorrow." And another called out, "We'll bring friends." The teenagers exchanged surprised looks. Could it really grow beyond this? Could their music actually spread further? They didn't know, but as they walked home under the fading sun, they carried something heavier than the coins in their hands. They carried hope. That night, their mother noticed their tired faces and the calluses on their fingers. She asked them where they had been, but they only smiled and told her not to worry. They wanted to keep it a secret a little longer, until they were sure it could really work. As she kissed their foreheads and told them to rest, the teenagers lay in their beds whispering about tomorrow. They dreamed of bigger crowds, louder applause, and maybe enough money to finally clear the bills stacked on that wooden table. What they didn't know was that their voices were already reaching farther than they could imagine, through the phones of strangers who had recorded them. Somewhere in the city, a powerful man had seen one of those videos, and soon, their lives would change in ways they never thought possible. The next morning, the 5 teenagers woke up earlier than usual. Their bodies ached from the long day before, but their spirits were alive with a new kind of energy. For the first time in weeks, they had gone to sleep with smiles on their faces, not just fear. They had a plan, and it was working, even if the results were small. They quietly gathered their instruments again, the worn guitar, the keyboard with missing keys, the buckets they used as drums, and their voices that carried all the hope in the world. With every step toward the city square, their bond felt stronger. When they reached the corner where they had sung yesterday, they were surprised to find a few people already waiting. A man waved at them and said, "We were hoping you'd come back." A group of women who sold flowers nearby smiled warmly as they set up their stalls, ready to hear the young performers again. The siblings exchanged amazed looks. They hadn't expected anyone to remember them. Their corner wasn't just a random spot anymore. It was becoming theirs. They set up their instruments, took a deep breath, and began to play. The guitar's chords rose into the morning air, joined by the steady beat of the buckets and the harmony of their voices. People walking by slowed down, curious, and some pulled out their phones immediately. Word had spread faster than they realized. By the time they were halfway through their second song, a small crowd had gathered, clapping and cheering them on. The teenagers didn't know it, But videos of their first performance had already made their way onto social media. People had shared clips with captions like, "These kids are singing to save their home," and "Pure talent on the street corner." Those short videos touched hearts beyond the square, drawing people who wanted to see them in person. Each day, more faces appeared, strangers carrying coffee, snacks, and sometimes even small notes of encouragement. The siblings began to feel that they weren't alone in their fight anymore. By midday, the crowd was larger than ever before. Tourists who had heard about them stopped by, taking pictures and recording videos to post online. Some even tagged local news outlets. The teenagers noticed none of this. All they saw were the faces in front of them, eyes filled with admiration, clapping along with their songs. For the first time, their voices echoed not just in the square, but across the city. Among those faces, one man stood apart. He was dressed simply, in a plain shirt and trousers, blending into the crowd with ease. His hair was sprinkled with gray, and his posture was relaxed. But there was something about the way he watched them, quiet, thoughtful, as if he wasn't just hearing the music but feeling every word. He didn't clap or cheer like the others. He simply listened, his eyes following every move, every expression of the teenagers on that corner. The siblings noticed him once or twice, but thought little of it. They were focused on their songs, pouring their hearts into the melodies. What they didn't know was that this man wasn't an ordinary passerby. He was a billionaire, someone whose name carried weight in boardrooms and business headlines, though almost no one would recognize him dressed so modestly. He had once grown up in a poor neighborhood himself, where music on the street was the only joy people could afford. Watching the teenagers reminded him of his own past, of struggles he thought he had long left behind. The performance continued into the afternoon. The siblings were tired, their voices beginning to strain, but the encouragement from the crowd pushed them on. Every time they thought about stopping, someone shouted, "One more song!" And the energy in the square lifted again. The small cup in front of them filled faster than it ever had before. Coins and bills piled up, a symbol of how far they had come in just a couple of days. The billionaire stood silently in the back, unnoticed by most. He saw the calluses forming on their young fingers, the sweat dripping down their faces, and the determination in their eyes. He saw the way they looked at each other for reassurance, the way they smiled at strangers even when they were exhausted. To him, it was more than a street performance. It was survival, it was love, and it was courage far beyond their years. As the sun dipped lower, the siblings played one last song, their voices breaking slightly from fatigue, but filled with raw emotion. The crowd applauded louder than ever before, cheering and whistling, their voices rising in waves of support. Some shouted blessings, others pressed folded bills into the cup before walking away. The siblings bowed their heads in gratitude, overwhelmed by the kindness of strangers. That night, as they counted the money together at home, their mother walked in and noticed the tired joy in their eyes. She asked again where they had been, and though they wanted to tell her, they held back, deciding to surprise her when they had enough to truly change things. They hugged her tightly, promising everything would be all right, even if they didn't know how. But far away, in a quiet corner of the city, the billionaire couldn't stop thinking about them. He replayed the songs in his mind, the sound of their voices lingering long after he had left the square. Something inside him stirred a memory of his younger self and a realization that maybe he had been given his wealth not just to live in comfort, but to make a difference. The teenagers had no idea their music had reached a heart powerful enough to change their entire future. They only knew that tomorrow they would sing again. The teenagers returned to the square again, just as they had the past few days. Their routine was simple now: wake up early, pack their old instruments, and walk together with quiet determination. Each morning, the weight of their struggles was heavy on their shoulders, yet the moment they started playing, the music seemed to lift that burden, if only for a while. By now, they were no longer strangers to the city square. People recognized them, smiled at them, and even waved as they passed. The corner that once felt intimidating was slowly becoming a place of belonging. When they began to play, the crowd gathered quickly, bigger than before. Some people had heard about them online, others had been told by friends, and many had returned because their voices had touched them deeply. What started as a handful of listeners had turned into dozens, even more, surrounding them as the songs filled the air. Phones were raised in every direction, capturing their harmonies. Children clapped along. Elderly men and women swayed gently to the music. It was as if the entire square had transformed into an audience, and these 5 siblings were the stars of the show, though they never saw themselves that way. Among the crowd, the same quiet man stood once again. The billionaire had returned, still blending in, dressed simply, unnoticed by most. He stood near the back, arms folded, his expression unreadable but his eyes fixed on the teenagers. He had spent the night thinking about them, wondering if they would come again, and now here they were, singing with the same raw passion that had shaken him before. He wasn't there for entertainment. He was there because something inside him wouldn't let go of their story. As the songs went on, the teenagers began to feel the exhaustion creeping in, but they refused to stop. Each note they sang was for their mother, for the home they were fighting to keep. They thought of the bills stacked on the table, of their mother's tired smile, and that gave them strength. Their music rose above the sounds of the busy city, carrying something honest that no one could ignore. Finally, after hours of performing, the oldest sibling strummed the last chord of their final song. Their voices faded, and for a moment, the square was silent. Then the applause erupted. The crowd clapped, cheered, and shouted words of encouragement. Some even threw money into the cup from a distance. The siblings bowed their heads, thanking everyone shyly, their cheeks flushed with embarrassment and gratitude. That was when the quiet man stepped forward. The crowd parted slightly as he walked closer. His presence carried a quiet authority, though no one yet recognized who he truly was. The teenagers looked at him nervously as he stopped right in front of them. He held their gaze for a moment before speaking. "You sing beautifully," he said, his voice calm but steady. "But tell me, why are you here every day? You're so young. You should be at school, with friends, enjoying life. Why are you out here, pouring your hearts into music on the street?" The siblings glanced at each other. They had tried to keep their reason a secret, not wanting pity, but something about the man's voice made them feel safe. The oldest took a deep breath and answered honestly. He explained about their mother, about the mounting bills, about the fear of losing their home. He spoke with trembling words, not because he was ashamed, but because the truth was hard to say out loud. The younger siblings stood close, their eyes shining with unshed tears as their brother's words carried the weight of their entire struggle. Crowd listened silently, and the atmosphere shifted. People who had only come for music now saw the real story behind it. Whispers ran through the square: sympathy, shock, admiration. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others placed more money in the cup without a word. But the man standing in front of them said nothing at first. He just looked at the children, his face serious, his eyes glistening as if he too was holding back memories of a life not so different from theirs. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a checkbook. The crowd gasped. The siblings stared, not understanding what was happening. The man flipped it open, wrote down a number, and signed it with quick strokes of his pen. When he tore the page and handed it to the oldest sibling, the teenager's hands shook so badly he almost dropped it. He glanced down, and his breath caught in his throat. The figure written, there was more money than they had ever imagined seeing in their lives. It was enough to pay off everything they owed, and more. For a moment, no one moved. The siblings looked at each other in disbelief. The crowd murmured, some gasping, others covering their mouths in shock. Tears spilled down the faces of the younger ones as they clung to each other. unable to process the miracle unfolding before them. The oldest tried to speak but could only stammer. The man placed a hand gently on his shoulder and said softly, "This is for your home, for your mother, and for your future. Don't stop singing. Don't stop dreaming. The world needs voices like yours." The crowd erupted in cheers, some clapping wildly, others crying openly. Strangers hugged one another, moved by what they had just witnessed. The teenagers stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events, their tears falling freely. They had started this journey hoping only for a little help, and now their entire world had shifted in an instant. The billionaire smiled faintly, but still no one recognized him for who he truly was. He didn't want fame or gratitude. He only wanted to make a difference quietly, just as someone had once helped him when he was young and poor. With that, he stepped back into the crowd, blending in once more, leaving behind a gift that would change their lives forever. The teenagers stood frozen, still holding the check in trembling hands. Their eyes darted between each other as if to confirm it was real. The crowd around them cheered louder, but the noise felt distant, almost like a dream. One of the younger siblings began to sob openly, covering her face with her hands. The oldest pulled her close, his own eyes wet, though he tried to stay composed. They had come to the street corner with nothing but borrowed instruments and hope, and now, in the blink of an eye, their entire lives had changed. The people in the square surrounded them with warmth. Strangers clapped their backs, shook their hands, and whispered blessings. A woman wiped her tears and said, "Your music touched us all. This is just the beginning for you." A man pressed a folded bill into their mother's old guitar case, even though he had already seen the check. Others simply stood in silence, overwhelmed by the kindness they had just witnessed. No one doubted that something extraordinary had happened in front of them. When the teenagers finally returned home, they rushed inside to find their mother still at the kitchen table, sorting through unpaid bills. She looked up, startled by their expressions. Before she could ask, the oldest carefully placed the check in front of her. For a moment, she stared, confused. Then she read the numbers, and her hand flew to her mouth. Tears filled her tired eyes, and she shook her head as if refusing to believe what she saw. Where did this come from? She whispered, her voice trembling. The siblings told her everything about the street performances, the growing crowds, and finally, the man who had stepped forward with unexpected generosity. She listened in silence, her hand covering her heart. When they finished, she pulled them all into her arms and cried. "You've given me the greatest gift," she whispered. "Not the money, but your courage, your love for this family. I've never been so proud." That night, the little house felt different. The walls no longer pressed down with fear. Instead, they echoed with laughter, relief, and the sound of 5 teenagers humming softly together as they held their mother close. For the first time in a long while, they slept peacefully, knowing tomorrow would not bring eviction notices or desperate worry, but hope. The news spread quickly. Videos of their performances had already gone viral, and now people were sharing the story of the mysterious man who had changed everything. Headlines read, "Street musicians saving their home receive miracle gift, and a billionaire's act of kindness leaves city in tears." Reporters wanted to meet them. Cameras wanted to capture their smiles. And people across the city, and even across the world, sent messages of love and encouragement. What touched hearts even more was the humility of the teenagers. When asked what they planned to do, they didn't talk about fame or fortune. They simply said, "We just wanted to save our home and help our mother." Music was all we had. Their words melted hearts everywhere, reminding people of the power of family and the strength of unity. The billionaire, watching quietly from a distance, never sought recognition. He let the world speculate about his identity, content to remain in the shadows. In his heart, he knew why he had done it. Long ago, he had been a child like them, facing hardship, feeling the sting of hunger, the fear of losing everything. Someone had shown him kindness when he least expected it, and that act had planted a seed that grew into the life he now lived. Helping these teenagers wasn't charity, it was passing forward the gift he had once received. The siblings, however, never forgot him. Though they didn't know his name, they remembered the way he had looked at them, not with pity but with respect, as if he truly believed in them. That memory became their strength as they moved forward. With the money, they saved their home, paid off debts, and gave their mother the rest she deserved. But they didn't stop there. They continued to sing, not for survival now, but for joy, for the people who had cheered them on when they needed it most. Soon, they were invited to perform at schools, community centers, and charity events. Their voices reached wider audiences, yet they never lost the sincerity that had first drawn people to them. Each time they sang, they remembered those days on the street corner, the clinking of coins, the applause of strangers, and the moment when their lives had turned like a page in a book. The final twist came weeks later when a letter arrived at their home. Inside was not money, but a message written in neat handwriting. It read, "Never forget where you came from. Your music is a gift, share it with the world. But more importantly, keep sharing it with each other. Family is your greatest song." It was signed only with a single initial. They didn't need to know more. They knew it was from him. Reading those words, their mother smiled through tears, and the siblings held hands. They realized that the true miracle was not just the check, but the reminder that kindness still existed in the world, and that love, whether through music or through sacrifice, was powerful enough to change lives. From that day on, they carried their story not as a memory of hardship, but as proof that hope is never lost. And every time they sang together, the world listened, not just to the music, but to the message hidden inside it, that even in the darkest moments, love and kindness can light the way.